Welcome back, kitties. To the show. Our friend Artichoke Tip took a little tumble down some stairs. So our show is going to change a little bit. I did what? So now the channel will feature torture, murder, and mayhem. Murder, torture, mayhem? What the? I'll show you murder, torture, and mayhem. Oh, sorry. Now I'm with our normally scheduled programming. Gotta go. Yeah, murder, mayhem. Oh. Hey there, YouTube. Welcome back to Artichoke Dip. My name is Rob, Solo Gamer. And in this episode, we're going to talk about miniatures. And I'm going to give a special shout out to a Mr. Adam Mitchell, who sent me a question. And this question is, I have a question. I, like you, prefer to use miniatures, but I can't find any cost-effective ones to use. Do you have any ideas? Well, Adam, in this video I'm going to cover this and give you a broad, we'll say, understanding of where you can find miniatures, collect them, and try not to break the bank while doing it. Now, before I get into this video, if you like my video, click the like button, and if you have not subscribed, please click the subscribe button, click that little bell icon, and every time I upload a brand new video, you will hear about it. So let's get into minis. And I'm going to cover a few topics here on where to find minis, how different types of minis, some paints that I like to use, and there's other paints out there, and get into some other areas of that, but that's later on in the video. So the first question is that I'm going to ask you out there. Now, for those of you that do enjoy to use miniatures and are into the miniature hobby, you know, these are questions you already have the answers to because you already enjoy the hobby. But for other people out there who are just now getting into this or starting to get into miniatures and painting and collecting them, there's some questions you have to ask yourself. And the most important question is, what level of detail do you want out of a miniature? And this is a very important question because the more detailed a miniature is, the more it will cost. But when you look at the grand scheme of things, what do you value? Detail or quantity? Because you're going to find in miniatures, you're not really going to get both at a cost effective. You're either going to get a lot of miniatures with very little to no detail, or you're going to get a few miniatures that are very highly detailed. So it's the first question you have to ask yourself. The second question you have to ask yourself is, what scale miniature are you looking for? Typically with tabletop role-playing games, the standard size miniature that you're going to find, and is the most common, is this right here, which is a 28 millimeter, or in a standard measurement, 1 inch. Now there are different scales out there, 28 millimeter being the most common, and then you have what they call 1/77, 70 seconds, 1/72, which, to break through the confusion, basically you have a 28 millimeter and then a 19 millimeter or 3/4 inch. So you will have a smaller miniature that will be scaled to right about here where this guy's shoulder is. And for some people it does not matter. For other people it does. Some people are very picky about miniatures and they want everything scaled the same on the board. So in order for them to go from a 28 millimeter to a 19 millimeter, it does not look the same to them. Then there comes the aspect of the smaller it is, the more detail there is, the more of a challenge there is to paint it. So these are all questions that you have to ask yourself before you even get into purchasing miniatures and have a better idea of what you really want out of it. Now, if you're looking to do something on the cheap and you really don't want to get into miniatures, you don't want to get into painting them and everything else that goes with it, perhaps you enjoy Theater of the Mind with Solo RPG, and maybe you're looking to, at this point, have a little bit of visual reference in front of you for time, space, movement, combat, whatever it may be. A real cost-effective way to go about doing that is you can go with tokens, and those are these guys right here. Just pieces of cardstock that have the images printed on them, both sides. You punch them out, and at that point you could put them on a map to represent where your characters are compared to where the encounters are, traps, so on and so forth. Now, I do know Pathfinder or Paizo Publishing, they do make a bestiary box, and I've seen it before, and I'm not a big Pathfinder guru, so I may be slaughtering that. It might just be monsters, I'm not sure. But it comes in a decent sized box, and I think you get like 1,000 of them. I think it's right around $25-30 somewhere in there. I think. I'm not 100% certain. And they have little black stands, and you take the cardstock out and you slide it in, and at that point it will stand up on your maps and for your game table. So for that amount of money, you do get a lot for your money. But however, it is cardstock, and to a certain extent, you have to exercise a little bit of caution with them, because you have to be careful if you have, soda pop or snacks, other things like that on the game table that may get on this stuff and ruin the cardstock, and then at that point you're out of that. Whereas with miniatures, they're kind of durable, and you really don't have to worry about that, particularly the resin ones. You can throw them around a little bit and not really have to worry. They're pretty simple to store. You can put them in boxes like that and really not have to worry a whole lot, which is what I like about them, and which is going to get me to, at that point, the next question you'll have to ask yourself. What kind of miniature do you want? And do you want a resin type of plastic miniature like this, that very durable, they hold paint well, they really don't break that often, and they're far cheaper than their cousins here, which are made out of pewter. And now the pewter ones are nice. They're very highly detailed. They take paint very well. There's only one problem with pewter. Not only does pewter a little bit heavier, obviously, than resin, but the other problem with pewter is sometimes the pieces, particularly with swords, bows, things like that, are very fragile. So when you go to store them, you don't really want to use something like this. At that point, you're going to want to get a foam case to be able to put these things in order to protect them, because they cost a lot more. There's a lot more time that goes into them and making them look exceptionally well for the game board. And after you put forth all that effort, time, and money, the last thing you want to do is throw them in a box where they all get ruined. So there's that associated cost with pewter miniatures. Now with my pewter miniatures, I'm a solo gamer. They don't really venture out of this area, so they just sit in my display case behind here. And of course over here I do have a foam case if I decide at one point that I want to go out and do some gaming abroad. At that point I could put my pewter minis in little foam case and they'll be nice and protected to when I get where I'm going. But I don't think that's going to happen. So now that you have an idea of materials that you can get miniatures in, whether it be pewter or resin or plastic, the scale, whether you want 28 millimeter, 19 millimeter, at that point, where do you find them and how do you get them at a reasonable cost? Well, that's always the tricky part. And just like I said, first thing you have to ask yourself, do you want quantity or do you want highly detailed? So you have to ask yourself that question and figure out what you want first. Now, one way you can go, and it's actually a really, really good deal, and I purchased these, and Wizards of the Coast released Magic the Gathering, a board game, which was like a hybrid game of HeroScape miniatures mixed with Magic the Gathering. Now, I particularly don't like Magic the Gathering. When it first came out, I loved the game, but unfortunately, as the years went by, I had a friend that he is absolutely nuts about Magic the Gathering, and we had played it so much that it just burned me out, and I hate it, and I have never played it ever since because I'm just so burned out on it. But when I saw these sets, I picked them up because they were cheap. The starter set was like 20 bucks, and then they came out with another follow-up set that was about 15, and then this was their booster set that was like $12. And you get a total of, I want to say 15 miniatures. Yep, you get a total of 15 miniatures for $12. Now, the featured miniature out of this set is the Eldrazi right here, which I haven't even painted yet because that's on the list of the other things to paint. I'm still trying to get through Massive Darkness. So this is at the bottom of the list. Now when they come out of the box, they're color coded to represent the different elements on the decks of the cards for your mana pools. Obviously, whether it be earth, fire, water, so on and so forth, of the main colors of the decks. And that's what the colors are supposed to represent. Now, me personally, like I said, I have no intention in using these for the game because I really don't like Magic any longer. I bought them for the minis. Now, the minis they're not too bad, but they're not that highly detailed either. And I'll see if I can hold that up there so you can take a good look at it. And I know it's all green, and once it's primered and painted, it'll bring out some detail. But compared to, we'll say, a D&D or a WizKids mini, where you have a lot more detail to the miniature. And that's where the difference really is. Now for me, this is good enough for me. Miniatures on a real reasonable buy, and I'm going to paint them up and I'm going to make them look really cool. I really don't particularly care that they're for a Magic the Gathering setting because when I'm done with them, they're just going to be for my tabletop RPGs. So there's one route you can go. And I know these sets, they're still in publication, and you can get them cheap. You can get them real cheap. Gosh, I think the last time I was at Meijer, when I saw this on the shelf, they had this for sale. I think it was like $8. So you can still get them. You can still look at eBay, Amazon, and other online retailers, and I'm sure you can still pick it up relatively cheap. Now, if you want to look for something to where you want to get a large amount of miniatures and you're not really concerned about scale, you're not really concerned about detail, you just want miniatures. One way you can do that, and I've had this for a long time, and you can still get these on Amazon cheap, and it's like the old Army guys, but it's like a bucket of knight miniatures. And I picked these up because there's some terrain features in here that they had included that I really liked. And when I got done painting them, they looked really great. They had a lot of detail. And I was amazed that they came out of this chintzy little set like this. But these guys, as you can see, it's a knight. It's about 2 inches. Let me take a measurement to make sure. I think these guys are scaled for 2 inches. About 1 3/4 inches. So overall this guy's about 1 3/4 inches. So, but they're like the Army guys that you'd get when you were a kid in the big pack. They're not that detailed whatsoever. And if you want to use these for miniatures, you can, and I'm going to talk about some of the things that you have to do before you paint them and you get ready to base them and put them on your board. Now, one of the first things you're going to want to do is get yourself a decent utility knife, or I like to use X-Acto knives, but these work well too. And particularly with these cheaper line of miniatures like this, you're going to see mold marks. And they're going to be these circle indentations all over the miniature. And the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to get all that off of there. You really don't want that to show up on the paint. So you can scrape that off lightly and either take some real fine sandpaper or, you know, a nail file and just lightly clean that up and make it nice and smooth, and then you can primer it. Now, any miniature that you get, and with Reaper Bones in the past, I've had one miniature set that I bought that I did have a problem with, and now I wash all of them before I even paint them, even though they say they're ready to go. But the one thing you have to remember about any miniature is they put an oil in the mold when they mold these things, and it's called a mold release agent. And here is the problem. They don't strip it off of these things before they're packaged and sent out. So when you get them, they still have mold release agent on them. And when you try to go paint it, it's not going to hold paint that well. And then you're going to notice after the paint dries and you touch it, the paint starts flaking off in your hand. So there is a way to take care of that. So one of the other things that I keep in my little miniature box here is a toothbrush. And I'll use Dawn detergent and some warm water. And the first thing I do is put a couple of drops of detergent with some hot water, drop these things in the bowl of soapy water, and I'll let them sit for about 10 minutes or so and soak. Then I'll go back, I will take the miniature out using the toothbrush, and at that point get into all those little areas and get all that mold release agent out, rinse them thoroughly with clean hot water, and then I let them sit and air dry overnight. And you'll find the next day when you go to put your primer on it, you'll get better coverage and your primer will stick. So there is another way you can go about getting miniatures relatively cheap. Now, a tub of these guys right here will set you back about 20 bucks. And the one problem is you're going to get about 4 different miniatures really out of the tub like this, and you're probably going to get like about 50. So you're going to have a lot of doubles. But if you're okay with that, there's one way you can go about doing that. Another way you can go about collecting miniatures, and I really do enjoy right here, Reaper Bones. I have just recently got this one out of a Dungeon Crate set, but I have bought a lot of Reaper Bone miniatures before and painted them myself. And unfortunately, when you get them, this is what you get. You just get a plain miniature. It's up to you to paint. Now, Reaper Bones miniatures, for the detail, you really do get a pretty good deal on these things, considering. And you have to go through their catalog and look. And sometimes you'll be amazed to find what they have to offer. And sometimes you can get miniatures as cheap as about $2.50 per miniature, which is actually pretty cheap compared to if you look at some of the other miniatures out there on the market, like WizKids here, that you would get out of the D&D companion set, which is the starter set. Which in my opinion is not a bad set. You get 6 pre-painted, highly detailed miniatures for about $15. So you just pull them out of the package and put them on the table and start playing. But if you don't want to deal with painting them and you just want to collect minis and use them to play on the board, this is one way to go. But if you're looking to collect more detailed, more, how do I put this, miniatures that you can at that point detail for your particular game table, then you'll probably want to look more like at a Reaper's Bone, to where you can get an overall miniature that you like, and then at that point paint it exactly the way that you want it. So there's some of the ways that you can get miniatures reasonably. And to be honest with you, the best way, how I've always done it, is just keep your ear to the grinding stone. Check Amazon, check eBay, look around and see when these manufacturers begin to do sales on these things. Typically you're going to find a lot of sales around the holiday season after Thanksgiving. In America here, which we call the Black Friday, or they call Cyber Monday. And they do a lot of sales, and I got a lot of cool game systems this year by looking at that. Particularly one of them, which was Massive Darkness, and that comes with like 85 or 86 miniatures, highly detailed miniatures, such as these guys here. Now the set normally retails for $95, but I got it on a Cyber Flash sale for about $50. So, you know, really good deal. Got a lot of miniatures, and if you think about it, and you break that cost down, $50 for the 80 some odd miniatures, I was paying less than $1 a miniature for them. So those are just some ways to acquire miniatures and find them. There's ways that I have done it before in the past is look on eBay, and you'd be surprised. Sometimes you can get bulks of miniatures, and these are just they're not going to specify what they are, and they're a bunch of loose miniatures. Maybe somebody's looking to get out of the hobby or something, and they're going to put them in a box, and they might sell them. They'll say, give me $20 for them, and then at that point you may get anywhere from 30 upwards to 40 miniatures out of it. But the cool thing about it is sometimes you'll get what they call ultra rare miniatures, which I had a HeroClix set that I had bought on eBay, and this is years back, and it came with 50 loose miniatures. It came in this plastic bag, and I was just going through them, and I was looking at the ones that I was going to rebase and put on my own bases for my tabletop. And there were a couple of other cool pieces, so then I jumped on the web and I started researching them, only to find out that there was a handful of them that I was able to sell a couple and not only make my money back on what I paid for the lot, but I actually made profit off of that. So what I paid for the lot to have it shipped to me after I got done selling 2 of these minis that sold for about $35 a piece, I made money on it. So there's another way to go about doing that as well, and looking at it. And I'm not saying getting into buy and sell and miniatures and all that, I'm just saying, keep your eyes peeled. Sometimes people will sell lots of these things for cheap. No. Those are some of the ways you can go about acquiring miniatures. Now, personally, me, if you're looking to get a decent amount for a decent price, I would look into the sets. That's going to be your best way. You're going to get the most amount of miniatures for the bang for your buck. If you start purchasing individual miniature by individual miniature, when you add up the cost of the miniature and the shipping and then purchasing the paints and everything else, you're going to find in the long run you're going to pay a lot more money. But then again, as I said, miniatures is a hobby unto itself, and it really is. And I think as far as where to get miniatures and my feeling on the sets, I think I've covered enough on that. So let's move on to bases. If you find a cool miniature that you like, that maybe is not on a base or was never really intended to be set up on a base, like so, what you can do to fix that. So if you decide to use something like this, and you can see they really don't give you much of a base. These things really aren't that stable, particularly if you're using them for tabletop games. You're moving around, you're writing, you might be erasing, doing stuff like that, and these things are going to constantly keep falling over. And the creases in maps, and the list goes on as to why these things aren't that stable. One thing I've always done is Reaper Bones, and these are called the Base Boss, and I've had these for years, and it was a package of, I want to say, like 15 or 20 of these bases, and they're just plastic discs like so. Nothing really, that spectacular about them. But what you can do is you can glue miniatures, if you decide to go this route, onto these bases, which will make them a lot more stable. Now, there's all sorts of glues out there you can use. I mean, there's all sorts of super glues and everything else, and so on and so forth. And, the list seems endless for the type of adhesives you can buy. What I have found personally works the best is this stuff when you go to do basing miniatures, and it's called E6000. Now I get this is already black, and the reason why I get the black is it blends perfectly with these bases, so I can base a mini, let it dry, and then when I go back, if I want to put detail on the base and everything, this takes paint extremely well, and when you're done you really can't even see where it was glued together. The E6000 also works extremely well. Sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, like when I was getting ready to make this video and I went to go pull this guy out of the foam packaging that they give you here, his little wing over here had busted off. Now, I had glued this with E6000, and it's probably been sitting for maybe about 45 minutes. And as you can see, it's reattached. Looks pretty good. I'll have to touch up paint when that time comes. I ain't going to worry about it right now. But the cool thing about the E6000 is even when it dries, it remains flexible. So where that's really good is when you deal with minis, resin minis like this, to where these things will move and, come here, these things will move and stuff like that. Sometimes they will get weak, and sometimes, that resin will break. It's very easy to put a drop of the E600 on there, let it dry, and it still retains that amount of movement and flexibility, and is a lot more forgiving than like a super glue, to where it's going to dry extremely hard and brittle, and it's not going to be that forgiving. You may be able to bend it once, twice, it's just going to break again. So me personally, when it comes to basing miniatures, I like E6000. Anything to do with miniatures, gluing the miniatures and stuff like that back together, I have to say it's by far the best glue that I've found. I have tried super glues, I have tried Gorilla Glue and all these other things out here, but I have not found its equal for miniatures and for what I use it for E6000. So let's give you some ideas on how to rebase miniatures. And with rebasing miniatures, even if you find something that may be in scale that seems to be pretty cool, it was never intended to be a miniature, so to speak. It might even be a little novelty item that was on like a keychain or something of that sort, but you want to make it into a miniature. You could always use the E6000 in the bases and put it into your arsenal as that. And I've done that before in the past too. You know, use your imagination. That's the cool thing about miniatures. Like solo tabletop role playing, you have to use your imagination. And once you do, and you look at this stuff, you know, you start to notice a lot of other things around you. Opens up more doors to more possibilities, and you're only limited to your imagination. So I've covered where to get some of the miniatures at. My personal opinion is the best way to collect, or how should I say, not collect, but to get a large collection of miniatures, you know, for your buck, which are the sets in my opinion. Let's move on to paints and talk about paints, and I want to talk about something called a wet palette as well. And I'm going to show you how to make one for cheap as well. So when it comes to paints, and I am always watching videos on miniature painting. I'm always trying to learn something new, a new technique, something like that. And it never ceases to amaze me when I watch some video demonstrations how I see people out there using high quality paints, and it seems like they spend all their money on high quality paints, but then when it comes to the paintbrush, they just go to the store and find the cheapest thing that they can possibly find and use that. And to me, that's a bad idea. When it comes to painting miniatures, you don't want the cheapest brush you can find, but we're not going to recreate a work of, you know, priceless art here. So, you know, something better than the cheapest thing you can buy is better, particularly with coverage and detail. And on top of that, just maintaining your brushes and having your brushes last for any amount of time. One of the worst things to do, like if you go to the dollar store and you buy those brush kits that they give you, and you notice that after you soak your brushes a few times that the glue starts to soften up, and you go to apply paint only to find that the tip insert right here has now fallen off and you got a useless brush, and it really does you no good. So one of the things about painting minis, the first thing you want to do is pay attention to the type of brush that you get. And like I said, don't find the cheapest thing you can find, but don't break the bank either. I will buy these in 4-packs, and I got a couple here that are unused. I got one that's extremely used, and you can see this guy right here. I've used it a lot. The tip is starting to, at that point, wear out. It's starting to widen at the end, but it still works really well, and I will use this thing over and over and over until I, at that point, can get every last penny off of it. Now these brushes, I can't even remember, they weren't really all that expensive. I think if you break it down, they were about $2.50 a brush, which is really not that bad. And I got a pack of 4 of them, and I just keep those suckers. You can see how it's got a real nice tip on it, And when it comes to doing extremely fine detail work, particularly when you want to detail something like this, you see the sword and the sheaths that this guy has back here, you don't want to use a big brush like this. Obviously it's not going to work. You're just going to slather more paint all over everything else and you're going to get on there. So you're going to want something that's going to give you more control, more coverage, and to be able to get in there and coat. Now, when it comes to painting miniatures, one of the things that tends to happen is we get paint on our hands, we get paint on the surface. Sometimes you're trying to hold this thing. I don't know, for whatever reason that miniature just doesn't like me today. Let's go on to this guy. So for whatever reason you're trying to hold the thing and you notice as you're turning it and all that, you're bumping the miniature, you might leave a fingerprint in it, and so on and so forth, and it can become frustrating. So here's a tip to use that will help you out. Get yourself an old medicine bottle. This is an old Airborne bottle. It spins because it's got the child lock on it. And with me, I just weight mine down. I put an old CO2 cartridge in there, which is more than enough weight. When I'm holding this, even if I was to put something larger like this on it, it's going to weight it down when I set it on the table and it's not going to fall forward. So I will use something like this. I'll take a little dab of hot glue, put it on there, let it set up. Now once it sets up, now I have this bottle I can hold onto, and as I'm painting I can turn the miniature like this as I'm applying the paint. And it's nice because once it's glued, you can turn it this way to get to your detail, or that way, or hold it like this, or whatever you're doing. Just makes it easier because you have a larger surface to actually hold on to rather than a couple of fingers on a little base. So there's an idea for you to use when it comes to painting your minis. Now, getting decent brushes is, and this is my opinion, I'm just giving you what I use and my opinions. Whatever you're comfortable with using with your minis or you find to work better for yourself, great. So I'm not saying that there's any rule set in stone that says you have to buy the most expensive brush they have, because you do not. Typically what I will do is I will buy sets like these, and I think this whole set was like right around 18 bucks. It's called the Crafter's Choice, and it has, for me personally, nice little rubber grips here. Makes it real comfortable to hold the brush for hours depending on what I'm doing, and gives me more control. And I really like that. So I think I've said enough about the brushes. I'm not going to beat it up anymore, guys. I'm going to leave that as is. I'll let you guys make a decision on what kind of brushes you like. I want to talk about paints. Now, when it comes to paints, Reaper Bones makes their own paint line. There's Valerio. There's all these other type of paint manufacturers out there. And some of them can get quite pricey. And I don't use any of those for my miniatures. And how I do it is I will use everyday acrylic paint. And I'm going to talk about these paints a little bit. So a lot of people, and I had even watched a video where this particular person said that they were a professional artist. And after watching the video, I was pretty well blown away for a professional artist not to understand the very first thing about an acrylic paint. And the thing about an acrylic paint is you can save a lot of money with an acrylic, particularly because they're designed to be cut with water and make the consistency what you want for the coverage. Now, to take paint straight out of a pot and put it onto a mini is a real bad idea. The reason why is this stuff sets up in about 20 minutes and it gets dry within about 10, say to 12 minutes. It starts becoming extremely tacky. And then at that point, every time you do another brush stroke over that same surface, you start to leave brush lines in it. And once it dries, you're going to see those. So let's talk about a way that we can, at this point, using a wet palette, utilize some of these paints and make some cool miniatures for yourself. So making a wet palette, you don't have to go to Amazon or eBay or anything like that and pay big money for a wet palette. As a matter of fact, what I like to use right here is an old Chinese takeout container. It seals real nice, and of course you wash it first. Obviously, it's been through the dishwasher, so it's gotten everything out of there. It's nice and clean. Don't smell anything. And you get the lid in which seals. So you want to take yourself some average paper towel, right? Nothing too fancy about this. And what I do is I fold the paper towel. Once I get it in there, I'll show you what I'm talking about. And I want to cover this surface down here, but I don't want the sides of the paper towel sticking up because we're going to put some baking parchment in there. I'm going to show you what that's for here in a minute. So I got one piece down there, you can see right now already, and I'm going to put another piece on top of that. Now the nice thing about this with using a wet palette is the fact that you can blend paints and leave them in there, put the lid on there and leave them. You can come back upwards to a week and a half later and your paints will still be wet and you can still apply them to your miniatures. Unlike using a dry palette where you just put them right on there and within, like I said, 20 minutes they're completely dry, and then you're just wasting more paint. Now when it comes to soaking, because you have to at that point moisten this paper towel, one thing you have to remember, depending on the water source, like here at my place we have well water, and obviously the water will change day to day. Sometimes you're going to get some iron deposits in it and the water's going to have a, well, rusty tinge to it. And I really don't like to use that with my miniature paints, because even if you're using a stark white paint you're putting on a mini and you get iron deposits into that pigment, it will blend and ultimately change the shade of that white, and when it dries you're going to look at it and think, well, wait a minute, this isn't what I expected. Why did it do that? So I always use bottled water. I know it's at that point been filtered, it's no iron deposits in it, I don't have to worry about lime deposits and all those other things you get with hard water. So then what I do is I add enough water onto the paper towel, and then I will push it down with my fingers like so. And as you can see, you see them little dimples right there? That's what you want to see. Now, this is going to take a little bit more than what I have here. So it's going to take about one more layer of paper towel, a little bit more water, and this will be ready. So I'm going to put another one in there. I might lay this one long ways. I think that's what I'm going to do. There we go. Now we're good. Now I have the consistency that I want. And you can see in there that paper towel, it's pretty damp. When I push on it with my finger, it leaves that indentation. It's not going to spring right back up. If it springs right back up, then that means the paper towel is probably not damp enough, and you have to add a little bit more water to it. Now you don't want this stuff so soaked to when you turn it like this, you actually have water pouring out. That's not the point. You want it damp, not literally soaked. So now what I will use, I will take standard baking parchment. Now baking parchment, for a lot of you guys, I'm sure either your moms or your wives may have this in the kitchen, so it should be relatively easy for you to get your hands on. If not, you can go to the store and buy this stuff. It's really not all that, you know, expensive to really get. I mean, I got, 90 square feet of this stuff for a couple of bucks. So it's really not all that bad. Now you cut your parchment, and you're going to want to size it to the tray that you're using. I'm going to show you how I do that here in a minute. So the nice thing about this stuff, if you take a look, it's already got lines that are at that point into this paper, just like grid paper, so you can follow that to the dimensions you're looking for and cut it. And then at that point, set it like so. And you can see right here my parchment is on top of this. So now let's take a look here. I'm going to use this green. And I'm going to show you what I mean by how far you can make your paints go by adding a little bit of water, using a wet palette, and it'll really help you not only save money, but you'll be surprised by using these, by the wet palette, watering down your acrylics a little bit, how well they're going to at that point cover the miniature. And when you're done, I think you'll be pretty happy with the results. So generally, the ratio that I will use is I'll put, shake it up a little bit. I'll put about a pea-sized drop of paint, as you can see right there. And this stuff's already pretty runny. Now there's one brush that I have that I've never ever dipped in paint. That's this one right here. This is used for one purpose and one purpose only. And that is to add water to my paint. And like I said, I don't use the well water, I use this. I just dip it inside there, and then one, and typically to a pea-size drop of paint, I'll add 2 drops of water. Take my brush, and I'm going to stir in that water. thin that out a little bit. And you can see it's quite a nice texture of the paint. It's going to flow pretty well. And let's just see how well it covers. And I think I'll do this area right here. It flows real nice. And the nice thing is I can dap the brush and it'll fall right into all those details with little effort. So if the paint was real tacky, I would be at that point constantly going over it with brush strokes, and then eventually what's going to wind up happening is I'm going to have those brush strokes permanently into the paint, into the miniature, I mean, in the paint, yeah. So as you can see, it covers extremely well, and using a little pea-sized drop of my acrylic, a couple of drops of water, I've really made that paint go quite a ways. Now, if I decide, because the nice thing is, I'm just going to add a little bit right here. So you can really start getting this miniature going. There we go. Covers really well. That's the first coat, and we're going to let that dry. It may need a second coat, but if it does, it's going to be a very light coat, unlike using just paint straight out of the pot, going straight from here to that, where it's going to get real thick, it's going to get clumpy, and it's not going to look that great. So, but what if I decide I want a different shade of green than what's there? Maybe I want to add a little bit more, we'll say, honey brown to it. And here's the nice thing about the wet palette where this comes in. So I'm going to do my normal pea-sized drop of paint to 2 drops of water. Get me another brush here to start stirring this up with. Here we go. Now, what if I want a different shade than just this normal shade? I can do this with the wet palette. Drag a little bit of that over there. Drag a little bit of this green over towards the center, a little bit more of the brown, and start mixing. Until I get the shade that I really want. I think that's pretty good right there. I like that shade right there. Now the nice thing is, I can start adding this to my mini right now, and maybe I'll add it up here. There we go. And there we go. I'm going to do a different shade up there. But now, like I paint a lot of times in the evening when I get home from work, I'll spend a couple hours doing that. And if I mix up a shade that I really like, now normally with a dry palette, Once it dries out, that's it. It's gone. You have to, at that point, try to retrace your steps and remember what you did to get the correct shade. With the wet palette, all you have to do is take your lid, put your lid on, and it's going to keep the moisture in, and you can let it sit. And it's going to sit for, it'll stay wet like that for a week or better. Now I have another wet palette over here I'm going to grab real quick. Now before I had gotten sick, because I was sick last weekend with the flu, and I didn't get a chance to touch any of these, I'm going to grab that wet palette and just to show you guys what the paint looks like in there. So here's another wet palette that I have had going on. This has been sitting for almost close to 2 weeks now. And as you can see, the paint is still very wet. And I haven't used this in about 2 weeks. So a wet palette works real well with your miniatures, particularly when you want to do certain shades and you want to mix those up and use it over a lot of different models you may have, or particularly maybe you have a larger model and you want to do it in steps, but it may take you a day or upwards to a week to be able to do it. You can use something like this and keep your shade nice and wet and go back to it every time you need it, and your miniature is going to retain that same color throughout the miniature, which is really nice. It's very convenient and it works out really well. Now when it comes to paints, like I said before, you could buy the Reaper Bones, you could buy the Valerio. There's a whole lot of paints online. Some of them can be very pricey, and some people swear by them, that's all they use. Me personally, I've always just used the regular old cheap Apple Barrel acrylic paints, or the Deco Art. And now some people will be like, you can't use that, you got to use this, you got to use that. I have found if at that point you wet down the acrylic paint correctly and you get the correct consistency, you'll get great coverage. It'll work very well, and as long as you use a wet palette, you can make any shade of paint that you want by using the colors and just mixing those up and experimenting, and come up with some really cool miniatures. And I've done that for a long time and I've been happy with my results. So just like with this guy right here, and let's do a side-by-side comparison here. This is from a Wizards of the Coast set. This came out of the factory with a professional, I guess you would say, paint job on it, right? And it's set just that way for that coloring. This is a Massive Darkness miniature, which is a demon. And this guy right here, I had painted using all acrylic paints and just blending the colors to get the color that I wanted on them. Doing a side-by-side comparison of the two and looking at them, I think they look pretty good. I really don't see any difference. Now I could probably go to Wizards of the Coast and probably buy specific acrylic paints that shades that they used for this if I wanted to have it for my set. But just using a wet palette and blending the colors, I was able to use my acrylics and come up with some really cool, at that point, shades of red to use. So let's talk about one more thing before I end the video, and I want to talk about primering your miniatures. Now when you go to primer, you can do it one of two ways. And if you're using darker colors being your blues, your grays, you're going to want to primer dark, particularly with a black. And that'll give you some really good shadowing effect and stuff like that. If you are doing a lighter color miniature, particularly if I was to replicate this right here, I would not primer this black. I would primer this white. All white. I would let it dry. Then I would mix my colors and my blues up and go over that. The reason why you want to do that is the darker color that you primer with, the lighter color you put on top, you're going to have to add more and more coats in order to cover it. But it will eventually bleed through. So if you're using lighter colors, like this is a very light blue, not a dark blue, you're going to want to use a lighter, at that point, primer. If you're doing darker colors, at that point you're going to want to use a darker primer all the way up to a black. If you're doing in between, and like this, as you can see, let me just pull one of these guys out. These guys come ready to be painted, and they do theirs in a gray. Gray's more a very neutral color for your miniature painting. It's really not all that dark, but it's not all that really white. It takes paint real well, and for most part it's going to show the pigment of the paint pretty well on it. So there's some food for thought when it comes to minis and how you can acquire, use, and collect minis. And with a little bit, there we go. First layer of that acrylic I put on this mini is already setting up pretty nice. As you can tell, I got some pretty decent coverage, and that was just with one coat. So I hope this video helps, guys. I hope it helps with miniatures, answer some questions about your miniatures, where to get your miniatures cheap, give you some ideas, give you some insight on paints, collecting paints, prepping miniatures, basing miniatures, what to use for miniatures, and give you some little other ideas that you can use. Put some miniatures on your board for relatively cheap, just using a little bit of elbow grease to get the job done. Now, if you like my video, click the like button, and if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, click the bell icon, and you will be notified every time I upload a new video. And I think this is where I'm going to end this video here. And this is Artichoke Dip signing off. See you next time, guys. Thanks a lot.